Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Amna Akbar, and it's my great pleasure to facilitate this conversation this morning between Silke Shaw and Harsha Walia, Unbuild Walls, Borders, Prison, and Abolition. Silke Shaw, to my right, has been working as an organizer on issues related to racial and migrant justice for over 2 decades and is an old friend and teacher of mine. Originally from Texas, she began fighting the expansion of immigrant jails on the US-Mexico border in the aftermath of 9/11. In 2009, she joined the staff of Detention Watch Network, a national coalition building power to abolish immigrant detention in the US. Now she serves as its executive director. She's the author of the new book, which somehow, do we have a copy of it? I know it's in the bookstore, okay. She's the author of this incredible new book, Unbuild Walls, Why Immigrant Justice Needs Abolition, published by Haymarket this year. And then Harsha Walia, further to the right of me, is active in migrant justice, anti-capitalist, feminist, abolitionist, and anti-imperialist movements, and as you all know, is the award-winning author of Undoing Border Imperialism and more recently, Border and Rule. We are so incredibly lucky to have Silky and Harsha in conversation today about migrant justice, prison abolition, socialist strategy, and the realities of migration and border enforcement. As you know, these are two of our leading lights on these struggles and questions, their intellectual commitments and their longstanding commitments to these struggles over time. We're going to have a substantive conversation roughly divided in 4 parts, starting with an assessment of border politics in the US and around the world, then turning to the state of our movements, before turning to strategies and tactics that we might learn from and replicate. It's a perilous and important time for the left, and I couldn't imagine a more important duo to address these questions for us. All right, so as we get started, I was just hoping each of you could help situate us in this moment of migration and border enforcement and politics. Silky with a focus on the United States, which is what your book focuses on, and Harsha globally. How do each of your books, your research, and your political work help us understand or explain this moment?
Hi, thanks for being here on Sunday morning. I want to bring some context in before talking about the moment that we're in, and I think the thing about this conference, this space, everybody who's in this room, is that we all know that the system of migrant detention, of mass incarceration, of border militarization that we have now, at least in the US context, was built very much by both Republicans and Democrats. There's absolutely no question about that. And it's very clear to us, and a lot of where our critique lies, and specifically with the Democrats, the approach to fixing or reforming or governing in general around these questions or concerns that have come up around these questions of migration, immigration, legalization, et cetera. Their approach, their reforms have only served to expand the system, to extend the carceral state. And that's what we know. We know all of this. Chapter 2 of the book is really reckoning with the Obama years and how harmful that was to where we're at now and those questions. Even knowing all of that, I'll just say this particular moment we're in feels shocking to some degree. It feels really, really shocking to see how far the Democrats have moved rightward on the issue of immigration. And so it's alarming. We're in a really, really tough space right now, and I'm grateful to be in this space to have this conversation because I think we have some stuff to reckon with. So in terms of situating the moment, the context in the US has been focused very specifically on passing quote unquote comprehensive immigration reform. That's really been the agenda, especially for the last 2 decades, which really means moving good stuff, quote unquote, good things like a pathway to legalization, a pathway to citizenship, with a trade-off for some bad stuff, which often is more border militarization, more criminalization, helping people who are currently in the country, who are relatively innocent, who are productive, who are patriotic, who are, the pinnacle of being a human being, at the expense of disposing of other people. That's basically been the formula for 2 decades. And this constant push to say legalization is the North Star, is the thing we need, and we'll accept more border militarization, we'll accept more criminalization, we'll accept that there's carve-outs for people who have interactions with the criminal legal system in order to get it. The most recent moment when that was possible was in 2013, where, after all this work to get a bill passed on the Obama administration, there was a injection of a $46 billion border surge amendment. And even then, the Senate passed the bill, and then it failed in the House. And this is sort of what we've seen over and over again, is that the Democrats move further and further and further to the right, and the Republicans just, keep moving to the right as well. And so that's kind of the thing that's happening. And then, that was 2013. In 2014, we start to see a really large number of Central Americans, sort of like a heightened moment of people coming to the border. And since then, it's been, the border crisis has kind of taken over the conversation. So fast forward to last fall. There's a lot more to say about the period between then and now. But fast forward to last fall, we're in this moment where, we're back again at this question of compromise, like what can the Dems do to get some sort of compromise? And in this case, it was specifically for funding for Ukraine, also Israel, also Taiwan, but really this way to get the Republicans on board to fund more money going to the war in Ukraine. And it was wild because, there was, of course, also Democrats wanted more money for, border militarization, more border patrol, all the other things. But the thing that ended up happening is they actually caved on putting a lot of policy changes into a bill that would gut the asylum system and actually just make things even that much worse, that would be much more permanent than just an injection of money. And they included that in the bill. And then it was kind of this real shift in the party that you saw. Whereas before, it was like, okay, we'll trade off everything we can. We're totally fine with this as long as we have legalization for a number of people in the US. Right now, roughly 11 million people who are undocumented. Usually any of these bills would be a much smaller number who would be benefiting. And then we do these trade-offs. But in this particular context, it was like legalization wasn't even on the table. Nothing in relationship to any real positive reforms of immigration were on the table. They were really small if they were there. And it was like border militarization was the trade-off for kind of anything at this point. So it set a new floor for the conditions we were in. And there was a few reasons that happened. I think partly, Biden early on, and we can talk about this more as we get into the conversation, but faltered very quickly when he came into office and kept in a lot of border closures that Trump had put in, and the border panic sort of took over and it sort of dictated everything, and they really sort of ended up not moving on any real significant positive reforms on immigration. And so that kind of took hold. And then, and this is, I think there's so much focus on Trump, but from my perspective and what I've seen is that actually the state of Texas, where I'm from, the Governor Greg Abbott in Texas is basically dictating immigration policy for the whole country right now. And what's happening is, and what has happened is that actually he put forth this sort of plan to bus migrants to quote unquote sanctuary cities, Chicago included. If folks are from Chicago, you'll know this very well. To bring the border to these sanctuary cities. And in the context of having, again, really weakened social safety nets in the sort of pandemic era, we've seen actually for years actually having 100,000 migrants come to a city like New York actually wasn't a huge burden. There was process, there was ability to support people, but now we're in this place where social safety nets are so weakened and there aren't the resources, and the Biden administration is not providing those resources and sort of letting Abbott run this plan, that liberals have all fallen into the trap. So now they're very concerned about the border. They're like, look, the border is in our communities. Oh no, we have a, quote unquote, we have a housing crisis. We have all these sort of conditions. What are we going to do about immigration? The scarcity mindset is that much more heightened. So there's no question that that has been a part of the play. And the thing that, and so, you know, the Democrats have moved to the right on this. We get to this point, and then they put forward this border security bill that, you know, a few weeks ago in Atlanta, Harris was doing like a big speech and was sort of boasting about how great this bill was. And one of the things she said was even Border Patrol endorsed this bill. And then she was like, look, Trump killed the bill, and actually sort of positioning Democrats even to the right of Trump on immigration. And so for, you know, one of the things I write about in the book is just how much tough on crime policy, how much the sort of moral panics of the 80s and 90s and the war on drugs have led us to this place of having more incarceration, more migrant detention in particular, is what the book's about. But I think, you know, that election in 1988 where there was this sort of exploitation of this story about William Horton and between George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis, and it was really just this way to kind of show that Democrats were not tough on crime, and it actually like gave Bush the election, and it was this heightened moral panic. One of the things that people say is that what it taught Democrats was actually running tough on crime was the way to win elections, and I think that's what we're seeing now, is that actually in 2016, and what Trump did leading up to that, exploiting the story of Kate Steinle and all the other things that sort of happened leading up to that moment, actually obviously moved us much further to the right and taught Democrats something. So even if they were positioning themselves differently in 2020, early 2021, since then, because there's no real foundational politics around this for them at all other than we're going to appease some immigrant rights activists who want legalization, everything has really moved to the right, and they see now that, you know, moving to the right on this is going to potentially win them elections. And so I think that is where we're at. It's a really tough place. And even now, earlier this summer, Biden put forth a executive order on like basically the bill didn't pass, and, you know, Harris is pushing that she'll pass the bill whenever, if she were to be elected. But he put forward an executive order that essentially was gutting the asylum system, outsourcing enforcement to Mexico, and things are looking different. The buses are not coming as much. Things are changing. They're like, oh, look, the Democrats actually did something. And then 2 weeks later, he put forth a executive order around parole for people who are undocumented, who are married to U.S. citizens or residents. Really, I mean, just like crumbs. Like, it's like you've had to be here for 10 years and all these other conditions. And it was CIR in play. Like, even if it didn't happen in Congress, it was like already, and they were like, look, this is a victory for the immigrant rights movement. I was like, no, this wouldn't have happened if 2 weeks earlier Biden didn't just signal that he was being tough on border. And of course, the state of Texas sued, along with other people, to stop parole in place. So that's sort of the reality. Again, Greg Abbott with his busing scheme, with all the different lawsuits, like, that is what's happening, and the Democrats are doing very, very little to sort of counter that, and in fact have just basically moved to the right. So those are kind of the conditions we're in. And like I said, I write a lot about this in the book, but even to me, I mean, this summer has been actually quite surreal to see how far it's gone.
Harsha?
Thank you, Silky. Everyone pick up Silky's new book. Yeah. How's everyone doing? Good morning. Good morning. It's good to see everyone. Thank you for being here, for spending your morning with us. Thank you to Socialism for bringing all of us together. And I want to start by, Amna, your question around naming this moment. And for me, it's so critical to also think about the continuities. And in thinking about the continuities, of course, of the ways in which settler colonialism is so key to understanding the border today, locally and globally, including, but not exclusively, to what is happening in Palestine and Palestine, and the ways in which the Nakba, the ongoing Nakba, is completely made through the construction of an apartheid wall, through the illegal ongoing Zionist occupation, and the genocide unfolding in real time as we speak in Gaza. And so I want to start by saying that there is no thinking about this moment or even thinking about borders without acknowledging the ways in which borders are completely underwritten by colonial occupation, right? Like every border on this planet has basically been rooted in a deep legacy of colonization. The majority of borders on this planet were literally the products of colonization and colonialism around the world, right? And so that is an enduring legacy of how to understand borders today. And I also want to be explicit here in saying that in understanding that also means expressing solidarity with those resisting borders and those resisting occupation. And so I also want to be explicit in saying here that I express my solidarity not only with the Palestinian people, but also with the Palestinian resistance that continues to fight the Zionist entity right now. In terms of what that means in terms of this moment as part of an enduring legacy, I think, as Silky laid out already in the United States, but we could expand this globally, the border has been a bipartisan project or a tripartisan project, depending on wherever you're located, literally everywhere, right? Like that is the story of global bordering regimes, that it is not limited to a right-wing kind of agenda. It really has been bipartisan policy all around the globe, as exemplified by what you have laid out and what we know in your work between the Democrats and the Republicans, right? And the Democrats have consistently pushed rightward through the Clinton era, through the Obama era, and that is seen around the world across jurisdictions. But perhaps what is most notable today, and maybe I'll pick up where you left off, Silky, in terms of like, what does that mean today and how much more rightward it is? And really, we see that around the world, that the kind of linchpin of growing global fascism is anti-migrant xenophobia, right? Like fascism is not universal. Like there is a growing global fascism. There are different tendencies and contours to what that may look like in different places. But one of the kind of pillars and linchpins of fascism across the world, right? Like whether we're looking at the United States, whether we're looking at Brazil, we're looking at France, we're looking at India, we're looking at other places, it really is anti-migrant xenophobia and the ways in which migrants have come to stand in for every kind of scapegoat that one could imagine that fascists construct, right? So, for example, in Canada, where I live, where there is, a putatively social democratic social welfare state, like, of course it's not. Or similarly in the Nordic countries, right, where that is what the kind of global image is. Migrants have come to stand in for those who are, quote unquote, stealing housing, stealing resources, stealing jobs, stealing welfare, right? Rather than actually talking about the growing neoliberal austerity and capitalism that is continuing to chip away at social goods and the public sphere, migrants have come to stand in for the demise of the welfare state, as minimally as it may exist. And so that, I think, is a really crucial connection in terms of understanding the way in which migration and fascism and capitalism are deeply intertwined in this moment globally. I think another thing in this moment, and Silke, you talked about this, is how the border crisis has become the mantra rather than the crisis that the border produces, right? So instead of talking about the way in which the border itself is producing violence, that the border is creating precarity, that the border is literally killing people, the constant language and semantics of the border crisis evades the violence of the border itself. And that is, of course, deliberate and like omnipresent, right? It's like in mainstream media, it's in everything we hear, it's in everything we consume. And so that has also, I think, become a stand-in for talking about the violence of the border itself. I think another thing that this moment highlights is the outsourcing of border violence that Silky, you touched on. And this is something that we're seeing globally, and I talk about this a lot because I don't think we pay attention to this enough. But we are so fixated on the site of the border itself. And so much of that is right-wing centrist propaganda, right? Like, Trump's gonna fortify the border. The Democrats are like, no, we're gonna fucking fix the border. We're gonna like build a bigger wall. Who's gonna build a bigger fucking wall? And in reality, the vast majority of border enforcement around the world is currently taking place in the periphery, what we know as the periphery. Mexico currently deports more Central Americans than the United States does, right? But at the behest of the United States, importantly, right? And so the ways in which borders are being outsourced both globalizes the violence of borders and maintains imperialism, right? Like, one of the key methods of maintaining imperialism in the world today is to tie imperialist trade and aid agendas to migration prevention. So, for example, in Europe, there is not a single trade and aid agreement that the European Union makes with African nation states. And of course, trade and aid is a longue durée of imperialism, right? Walter Rodney teaches us that. But every single trade and aid agreement that the EU currently makes with an African nation state or with the African Union is dependent on preventing migration. That is a key condition of these agreements. And so that looks like, for example, people may have heard in the news, Rwanda becoming an epicenter of violence to prevent African migrants coming through those routes of migration, or the horrors unfolding in Libya, or the ways in which the EU is complicit in funding the RSF and the counter-revolutionary violence in Sudan. And on and on and on, right? And so migration has become a key way of understanding imperialism today. So imperialism is, of course, boots on the ground, it's military bases, it's occupation. And it's also following the money when it comes to migration prevention deals that almost every single country in the imperial core is making with its peripheral colonies, right? And so I think that is really crucial. And, I'm not talking about the US because Silky has already outlined that. I'm talking in a global sense. In the context of Australia, for example, Australia literally offshores detention to other island states, like literally offshores those entire detention centers, right? So border outsourcing, I think, is key. And another key part of border outsourcing is the ways in which border outsourcing has also become a way for countries in the imperial core to absolutely absolve themselves of any responsibility, right? So there are no lawsuits that people can launch, right? And we can close detention centers here, and that is so important. But what does it mean when then those detention centers literally get outsourced across our borders, right? That is why, for me, thinking about migrant justice is so critical to internationalism, because borders are a way in which violence is continuously outsourced. It is this key method of thinking against NIMBYism, right? Because that violence is constantly being outsourced. No matter, we try to stop something, and it's not just in someone else's backyard within the border. It literally gets outsourced to another country. And so that becomes so crucial to think about, it becomes a way to evade responsibility, right? And this is playing out in the EU right now every single day, where people are trying to launch accountability campaigns, and the EU's like, well, we're not responsible for what's happening in Libya. We're not responsible for literal enslavement in Libyan detention centers of North African migrants, because that's a quote unquote over there problem, right? So it also reproduces racial regimes of how we imagine the quote unquote other places to be, right? And so I think those are some of the key things globally to think about when thinking about this moment. And maybe the last thing that I'll say around this moment that I think is really important is that we tend to think about the border as primarily a method of exclusion, right? Like who's being detained, who's being deported. But I think the last thing I'll say that is crucial in this moment in the United States and elsewhere is that the border is not about excluding all people. It is about creating the condition of deportability, right? We know that places like the United States could actually deport every single person that they wanted to, if they wanted to, right? Like there literally is the surveillance and carceral power to do so. The reason is not that these countries are interested in deporting all people. It is to create conditions of deportability precisely in order to create labor and social unfreedom, to create precarity, right? Folks here, union organizers, if you are a union organizer, you know that one of the key methods of bosses during union drives is to call who? Immigration, right? ICE. In the United States, 52% of union drives are busted through collaboration with ICE. And so it is not, detention and the border walls, like these are important sites of struggle, but deportability is the key function, I would argue, of borders. And if we look at it globally, things like migrant worker programs, guest workers, which become, and this is really important to understand for people in the United States, is that one of the things that the center does, and that is to use the center loosely, is one of the methods and one of the ways in which they respond to outright right-wing exclusionary rhetoric is to say, we're hard on the border, we're hard on crime, all of that. But also often their carrot is like, oh, look, we have a temporary visa program. Right? Like, we're not as bad as the right because we're letting people come, but under conditions of essentially indentureship. Right? These are like the new Bracero programs. For anyone who follows the GCC countries, this is the kafala system, right? And this is not unique to any particular place. This is a functioning of racial capitalism that requires cheapened labor. There is no such thing as cheap labor. There is only cheapened labor. And one of the ways in which the global labor force is segmented is through the border, right? So the insourcing of quote unquote guest workers is the flip side of the outsourcing of work that's happening in free trade zones, that's happening in sweatshops. So the kind of work that can't be outsourced, but still is needed in the imperial cores or in other rich economies, gets insourced by cheapened migrant workers, right? And so this global circulation of cheapened labor, I think, is the last thing that I would say is so important to understanding about bordering regimes. That is not just about deportation and mass raids. It is, of course, about that violence, but it is understanding the ways in which the border is a key method and a spatial fix for global capital. And so to dismantle the border, like at its core, and bordering regimes, is to undo and dismantle racial capitalism, is to undo the global apartheid that endures in this world. Like who can live where and under what conditions is determined, not exclusively, but including primarily through borders, right? Like who has the right to life and under what conditions? And I think in an era of global escalating fascism, we have to understand that fascism is constituted through the border.
All right, I want to ask both of you now to bring, in some sense, the left into the picture, because as we all know, we've been living through this era of protest and movement around the world in some real sense. And so in the United States in particular, of course, we've had a resurgence of a range of movements and modes of resistance: prison abolition and migrant justice, indigenous sovereignty, environmental justice, and so on. And of course, each of your books, one of the things that's really remarkable and important is that you push us to think about these struggles together. and celebrate that the connections between our struggles is central to our theories and practices of social change, as it should be. And that's not, but the way that we've kind of gotten there in the United States, kind of understanding the connections between these struggles, is not simply because in abstract they are, or in practice they are. It's also a product itself of organizing and activism. So if the first question was kind of asking us to narrate the moment in terms of border politics and migrant enforcement, where are we now in terms of left movement politics paying attention to the question of migrant justice and immigrant organizing?
Well, I want to go back a little bit and talk about how we got here in terms of where the movements are at. And I think, so much of the book and, a lot of conversation is happening about abolition right now. And I feel like in the context of immigration, we saw in the 80s and the 90s this sort of merger of the systems of immigration enforcement and the criminal legal system. And I think that, that sort of happening more and more sort of required this sort of better understanding of the criminal legal system actually by immigrant rights, immigrant justice activists. And so when you think about it, post 9/11, I think a lot of people think about it as this period of a lot of injection of resources into militarism and the war on terror abroad, but the domestic war on terror actually functioned through the criminal legal system. That's how it operated in so many ways. And whether that looked like ICE police collaborations or even as we saw prosecutions go up at the border of people crossing the act of migration, which meant that people would get 6 months in jail if they did it twice, 2 years in prison, in federal prison, more than that, or if they had other crimes, 20 years in federal prison. And we just see this really expansion of not just quote unquote civil immigrant detention where people are going through an administrative process about their status, but also through the criminal legal system and the federal courts. And by 2004, actually, immigration crimes are the #1 crime in the federal courts in the US, which is a lot of what brought me to the work when I was organizing in Texas. We just saw actually this, post 9/11 was a prison boom at the border. That's what we were seeing, and we were trying to stop it. And there are these particular moments in 2006, and some folks might remember this or have heard about this, but there was the largest immigrant rights marches we'd seen in the US, millions of people on the streets, especially places like Chicago and LA, and it was a rejection of what was happening. There was a bill that was moving to say, make it a felony to be in the country without status. And millions of people were brought to the streets, but again, what we saw was this sort of effort by Beltway groups, DC lobbyists to say, this is about legalization, this is about citizenship, this is about being patriotic, and moving the bill in that way. And during that period of time emerged, a more radical immigrant youth movement that didn't sort of accept the frame of we came here as no fault of our own, and started to sort of really reject those questions. But at the same time, and this is what I think the Obama period is so important and instructive for us to understand, it was because Obama was so committed to having that merger of the immigration enforcement system and criminal legal system be that much more serious, and very specifically saw people who were undocumented or even legal permanent residents who had interactions with the criminal legal system as the problem with immigration in the country, and really saying, okay, we're going to go after those folks and much more closely tie these systems together and have even more ICE police collaboration and have more surveillance and have more data-driven strategies to target immigrants. Deportations skyrocketed. And that meant that immigrant youth who are now being targeted, and even beyond that, people who are feeling their loved ones in their communities be targeted, an expansion of the detention system, all of those things happened, they started to have to really understand the criminal legal system. They're like, wait, how is this happening? Why, just an encounter with police or in booking or anything, it's just sort of a gateway to the deportation process, essentially. And so there was this, all of a sudden, a lot of immigrant justice people were sort of forced to understand it better, started connecting with groups that were doing work against things like stop and frisk in New York City, and started having a sort of clear understanding. It was sort of organic because of the conditions that were created. And at the same time, those years under the Obama administration was the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. And all of a sudden, this movement that was like basically a movement for legalization, not actually a movement for racial justice or migrant justice or an anti-imperialist movement, definitely not, started to kind of see those connections. And immigrant youth and young Black and brown people who are also being marginalized and being targeted by police were making those connections, and that also started to shift the conversation and get to this place where, there was this desire to have a more racial justice movement and, more civil disobedience, more challenges to what was happening, more challenges to deportations. And what was sort of remarkable is that actually we got to a place where we don't have that level of deportations anymore. And part of the reason we got there, and one of the distinctions I think is really important around this is that there's a lot of different types of deportation. So there's, in the context of the US, there's formal removals, or formal deportations, whatever you want to call them, where somebody is like sort of forcibly removed, and then they go through the immigration process, they go through the deportation system, and when they're removed, and deported and banished, they have a 5-year bar to reentry. And if they try to come back, then they could be prosecuted for unlawful reentry and get 2 years in prison. So the way that the Obama administration sort of was deporting more people, it actually was bringing more people into the federal prison system. So what we see now is actually many more expulsions are happening at the border where people are turned away and then they might come back, but they don't have those same sort of bars to reentry. But during that period of time, we had the highest levels of formal deportations, over 400,000 a year at points, and people in community, and people were feeling that. And so the sort of response was more civil disobedience. We got to a place where actually deferred action for childhood arrivals was implemented, which is not perfect in any way, but did help some 800,000 people, which is actually quite significant. And we had more and more sanctuary policy that said, no, we're gonna, as we understand the criminal legal system, we're gonna start to stop these connections and protect immigrant communities, and we're in a really tough place. And the thing I didn't talk about before, of course, is that there's this big push around a supposed migrant crime wave happening right now, and this is a big challenge for us right now. But I do think that those things combine, temporary protected status for more countries that allow people to work in the US, all of those things actually got us to a place where formal deportations are actually much lower than they were during those years. And actually during the Trump era, we were able to even push further on sanctuary policy and a lot of different things during that time. I think one of the challenges is that actually when this whole movement and both the sort of organic nature of it, but also the funding and the sort of nonprofitization of it and all the other things, all the investments go to legalization, and all the investments are about people who currently live here. And so any of that analysis that Harsha so brilliantly offered is not there actually in the movement often. And it's not really understanding that, we are in this place, and so much of what I talk about is the sort of good immigrant versus bad immigrant, which is often in relationship to that sort of productivity question, the, obviously patriotism, this question of, relationship to the criminal legal system, but we're really in the old immigrant versus new immigrant, and I think that's gonna sound familiar to everyone. Everything's about it's about us here, and how do we make the case for us at the expense of others, and the other people are coming, without any sort of recognition of the fact that strategy, as we've seen time and time again, has led to more dehumanization of migrants, which hurts people here. And so we're in this sort of cycle, and I think, I hold on to those moments, and I think especially in, sort of the last thing I'll talk about in this context is, I start out the book in this moment in 2020, which, at a socialist conference, a moment of conjuncture, a really serious moment of, several years of Trump. There's this sort of surface level shift on immigration in a very like liberal sort of frame. Abolish ICE, family separations, all those things, which lots of thoughts on. But that's there. There's, of course, the pandemic, and really starting to understand, like it opens up space to understand the damage that prisons and jails do to both people living who are incarcerated in them, but also the people who are in surrounding communities, and the push to free them all. And of course, the 2020 uprisings for Black lives. And that was the moment in my time, you know, I've been doing work around migrant justice for 20 years and against prisons for 20 years. It was wild how much we were able to do in that moment to push people to say, end detention. That was the best, that was the moment where we could say that, and we could say that to the administration. We could say, we got mainstream groups on board. And remarkably, during that period of time, we all really got in line. It was a united front, and we pushed and we pushed and pushed. And Joe Biden's first day in office, he released, you know, a bunch of different executive orders and all the different things. And it included a moratorium on deportation, something that we had been calling for years. It was remarkable. It also included a set of enforcement priorities that had a check on ICE agents, said ICE agents can't just rampantly target people. Like, we're gonna actually prevent them from doing that. It also included a introduction of a legalization bill that didn't have bars on people who had had interactions with the criminal legal system. It was like wild to see where he had come. And it was because we had done that work for so many years, and we took this opportunity when there was an opening to really make the case, and we saw that. And then, of course, it faltered. And all the things that I write about in the book about the sort of divisions in the movement and the good immigrant versus bad immigrant, and the real push for citizenship without any sort of context of what bordering and imperialism and all the other questions that actually led us to this point that we have these conditions mean they're all at play right now. And in fact, in so many ways, it's been a really hard summer to see how far to the right not just Democrats have moved, but also the immigrant rights movement to really accepting the border security line, really getting behind Harris and saying, oh no, this is gonna be our opportunity, without actually like taking in what she's telling us, which is, I'm gonna be to the right on Trump on border. That's essentially what she's been saying for weeks. And so I think we're in a really tough spot, but I think so much of what Harsha was sharing is actually, from my perspective, we're in a tough spot, but this is a time to really move our principles and do the thing where we're like, okay, how do we understand ourselves both as a racial justice struggle, but also as an anti-imperialist struggle? And it has been, for me, has been remarkable to see the shifts within the movement around what is happening in Gaza and Palestine. And it's not to the degree that I would hope, but I do think that there are people who are craving that, and that is something that is giving me some hope. So.
Thanks, Silky. I do want to say, Silky, I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit, because I do want to say that when did we meet?
Probably at like the DWM conference in 2013, 2016, I don't know.
2013, yeah,
Something
10 years ago or something. But I remember Silky had organized in the United States a conference around Detention Watch, organizing, and at that time was really pushing for member organizations to take a position, not only to reform immigration and detention centers, but to really get rid of them. And so I would offer, as someone who does not live in the United States, one of the trajectories is Silke Shaw, and your work over many, many years. I mean, this question is obviously hard for me to answer because I'm not in the United States, and so I'm offering some very humble observations as someone who's not here. I think a lot of people, obviously, who are here and who are organizing here would locate this moment as you did in terms of that kind of convergence in a post-2020 moment, and, the convergence of migrant justice and the very necessary influence of abolitionist movements and Black-led abolitionist movements on the migrant justice movement. I think it's also important, in addition to lifting up, Silky, your work, the work of Black migrant justice organizations in the United States, like Baji, work that has been done by Haitian migrants for so long. And I think that is so crucial in understanding that the links between migration and criminalization and the carceral legal system have long been understood as intertwined, just perhaps not in what, as Silky, you specified, like the mainstream immigrant rights movement, right? And it is, of course, by design that mainstream movements always look mainstream. Like that is the nature of them being mainstream. So I think it's also important to lift up that these are not mutually exclusive movements. And that indigenous organizers at the border, for example, have long been talking about the abolition of the border, because again, like the communities in Odom territories have been talking about this since before I was an organizer. Like I was heavily influenced by their zines in the 1990s. And so, I understand that the question is more like, how is this increased? But I think it's really important to understand that these parts of the migrant justice movement, as someone who is an anti-colonial migrant justice organizer, like for me, that was the center. Like that was not a fringe part of the movement. That was the center, like so crucial to my understanding. And I would also offer, so again, I'm not in the US, so I can only offer this as someone who organizes in so-called Canada. When I started organizing in No One Is Illegal, like that actually was our analysis. And I don't mean this as a like, we did it first or any of that. I just mean like in many parts of the world, the migrant justice movement has always understood itself as part of a anti-colonial analysis. One of the refrains of No One Is Legal in Canada is no one is illegal, Canada is illegal. Gladys may remember this. Gladys actually was one of the folks who marched in No One Is Legal marches and helped and was involved in organizing in so-called Canada, like, I don't know, over 20 years ago, right? Like, this is not a 2020 moment. Jack may remember this. And so that was, and this is also not just about Canada. Like, in many parts of Europe, the sans-papiers movement in France, which is primarily led by Algerian migrants, has so critically articulated the relationship and the colonial relationship between France and Algeria. And how that is a precondition of the so-called migrant crisis of Algerian migrants in France, right? Or in Greece, where some of the front lines of abolitionists in Greece are Black and brown migrants on the streets of Greece, who since the 1980s and 1990s have been fighting the pigs on the streets and building mutual aid networks and building self-defense collectives. Like, these are the center of those movements, right? Or in the UK, what we're seeing now has a long legacy in the United Kingdom of migrant justice movements that are anti-racist, that are anti-colonial, that are abolitionist as we understand it, right? Who are against the cops, who want the end of prisons, of police, and the conditions that allow for the rise of policing, right? Like not just the end of police and prisons, but an end to the social and material and economic conditions that allow for the rise of the prison industrial complex. So that has always been critical to migrant justice movements in many other parts of the world. I certainly can't talk about every movement around the world, but I would just offer that in a humble way, that perhaps what is located right now is a new moment in the mainstream migrant justice movement or immigrant rights movement in the United States is actually how most migrant justice movements already articulate themselves, because these connections are so intrinsic, right? And maybe I would love to hear from folks who are here, but when I got this question, I was thoughtful also about the fact that maybe there's a part of US left memory that has been lost, because when I think about the organizing against Gitmo, against Guantanamo Bay, right? Like that was not, so everyone knows Guantanamo Bay, so, yeah. And so, some of the first organizing against Gitmo was not to like reform Gitmo. It was to shut Gitmo the fuck down. And that was led by Haitian migrants, right? Who were incarcerated in Gitmo and the incarceration of Haitian migrants and refugees in Gitmo really foreshadowed what we now know as the detention centers, right? And the mass explosion of detention centers through the 90s. And so that movement was to shut it down. When I think about the sanctuary movements in the United States in the 1980s, the sanctuary movement in the United States in the 1980s had a deeply anti-imperialist analysis. Like the entire analysis of the sanctuary movement was that people were taking quote unquote illegal, extra legal action and explicitly drew on abolitionist histories, explicitly talked about the relationship of freedom, right? Of enslaved people seeking freedom, and drew on that specific history through the sanctuary movement, explicitly talked about the relationship of imperialism in Latin America, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador during the 1980s, the ongoing dirty coups that the US was complicit in, as central to why the sanctuary movement was needed. And so, those are just two moments perhaps of like how we got here, is also that maybe there is something to revive. And I think, Silky, you named something really important, which is that, I think in the 90s and early 2000s, we all, but especially in the United States, experienced the deeply demobilizing impact of the nonprofit industrial complex. And the ways in which that both siloed movements, right? So the immigrant rights movement suddenly became the immigrant rights movement that is somehow detached from Black liberation, even though for many decades, the spear of migrant justice, I would argue, on these lands were Black migrants, right? Like Haitian migrants in Gitmo, like organizations that preceded and continue to be Baji and Haitian Bridge Alliance and others. That were always making the links between prison abolition, stop and frisk policing, and the war on drugs, right? The triad of the war on drugs, the war on migrants, and the war on terror was long articulated. And so I am thoughtful about the ways in which, perhaps it is not new, perhaps there was an interruption for a few decades because of the demobilizing of the NPIC, because of austerity and all the ways in which austerity forced us into our single issue kind of mobilizing in general, and the ways in which, around the world, there was a different orientation to internationalism that meant that we didn't see ourselves as part of a global movement, but that we ironically kind of nationalized our own thinking around how movements organized. And so I'm not suggesting that there is nothing new, but maybe what I offer is someone who doesn't live here and who's perhaps slightly older in the movement, and that there is a lot that we can draw on, both to create something new, but to also honor that these legacies are something that we can continue to build on, rather than think, there's something about thinking that we're constantly building something new can also be tiring. Right? Like, of course we constantly need new ideas and new energy, and that is so crucial, but maybe some of it is just like, I am building on something that is ancestral, and that there are ancestors and freedom fighters that I can draw on in terms of continuing to build this legacy.
You two are really incredible, and this is a very, very rich and helpful conversation. So I want to make sure we have time for Q&A, so I'm going to combine the last two questions into one, which means I'm going to ask a bunch of questions, and you two can decide in your wisdom and your discretion where you want to take it. So we're at the Socialism Conference. I think it might be useful, and Harsha, you started to do this, I think, in response to, or a little bit earlier, but what do migrant justice and border struggles have to do with socialist projects and politics now? So not simply at kind of like a broad theoretical level or ideal level, but practically speaking, within the context of contemporary or actually existing movements and struggles on the left. And then the other thing to kind of maybe take on is how that relates to successful strategies and campaigns that you think we can learn from or try to replicate today.
I think migrant justice struggles. I am obviously on like a single track train here today. I think they have to do with literally everything. And in terms of like actual concrete, like you said, socialist projects, not just theory, again, it is impossible to think about, Silky, as you were saying, what does it mean to think about the border? Means to think alongside what it means to end displacement, right? And to end displacement means an end to occupation, to end to colonialism, and end to capitalism. And so organizing against those forces in the concrete, like ending the genocide in Gaza, means that people are not being forcibly displaced, right? That is part of the fight. That is so central to the migrant justice fight. In the kind of UN liberal policy speak, Palestinian refugees are considered the most quote unquote protracted refugee population. And it's like, the reason it's fucking protracted is the ongoing Zionist occupation of Palestine, right? And so it is crucial, it is like absolutely crucial to participate actively as migrant justice organizers in movements to liberate Palestine. One of the folks that was involved in co-founding, known as Legal in Canada, for example, one of the central organizations at the time were Palestinian refugees, right? And Al-Awda, the Palestinian Right of Return organization, has been central to migrant justice struggles. So to me, like, these are real live mobilizations to continue to support. These are not separate issues that we're like just in alliance with or extending solidarity to. These are intertwined struggles. I think also struggles for real, meaningful climate justice, and all of the things that are happening around that. And I think, for example, not Green New Deals that are greenwashing or that displace green technologies and extraction to the Congo, for example, right? Like, those are real live projects that are deeply connected to migrant justice, because climate disasters are increasingly the primary method of displacement right now for people. Every 2 seconds, someone is displaced by climate disasters. And so all of the mobilizing, not for like mainstream greenwashing shit, but for like meaningfully ending, is this live streamed?
I think so.
Oh, okay. I'm swearing a lot. Okay. Socialism. Every like meaningful climate justice movement is intertwined with migrant justice, right? Because that means an end to climate displacement. I think I was, saying earlier that there is no way to think about organizing on the shop floor or union drives without centering migrant justice, because ICE is involved, because precarity is produced by the border, because it is so crucial to understand and fight against the kind of racism that allows bosses to pit workers against migrants as if the migrants are not also workers, right? The very category of migrants stealing jobs presupposes that those migrants are not also workers, right? And so the kind of concrete ways in which we are constantly organizing on the shop floor to say, no, our enemy does not arrive on a boat. Our enemy is the fucking guy in the limo, right? Like, those are the concrete politics that intrinsically connect socialism to migrant justice. And I would just reiterate that there is no way to be an anti-fascist today if you are not anti-border. The border is the way that fascism is maintained. And so anti-fascist organizing has to contend with the growing onslaught and rhetoric that migrants are somehow responsible for whatever social issues are projected onto migrants and refugees, right? Like, that is a necessary and key part of that fight. It is part of how we undo the divide and conquer that is necessary for fascism to survive. It is central to how we undo austerity thinking, right? Like neoliberal austerity thinking of scarcity. And I think, migrant justice is, of course, so central to abolition, right? Like, abolition of police and prisons and borders and detention centers are completely intertwined projects, right? Like they are sites of containment and immobility. And so all projects that are fighting against gentrification, that are fighting for the closure of prisons and detention centers and jails, these are all concrete ways in which both migrant justice and socialist projects are moving forward. Fights for sanctuary cities, right? Ensuring that spaces that provide public services, that they don't become deputized as border guards. Those are very concrete ways in which we ensure that migrant justice struggles are not just at the border, they're literally everywhere, right? If social housing opens up in your neighborhood and one of the criteria is that you have to be documented, then there is a struggle against the border right there. If there are hospitals refusing services to people because they are undocumented, there's a fight against the border right there, and to advance socialism, because there is no public good that can have a border, right? And also, the last thing that I would offer, and this is currently in the Canadian context, one of the strongest movements, but has been going on for many, many decades, is we have consistently articulated status for all people, not a program with conditions. Status for all people. It means it does not matter how long you have lived in the country, right? It does not matter whether you work in the wage economy. It does not matter whether you have a record. It does not matter whether you are quote unquote producing, productive, or deserving across all of those lines of oppression, right? And so for me, in the same way that defund is the floor for abolition, status for all is the floor for an anti-border politics that is incredibly practical to advance, right? When we argue status for all people, that does not matter, that is like essentially a politics of no human being is illegal, and that the border needs to be abolished, and the bordering regimes that exist within our society that allow for the border to be reproduced should also cease to exist. And so I think those are very practical ways in which we can organize and put these kinds of politics into daily practice, no matter where we are, no matter what movements we're organizing in.
Okay, following Harsha. I mean, like, migration and immigration, it's just inherently intersectional. There's just what you were saying, there's just like no escaping. It's literally about everything, which is both a challenge because actually a lot of things have to change these conditions, but it's also an opportunity to bridge those sort of questions. And, given what you were saying and what we know, which is migrant, xenophobia and sort of these strategies are actually the thing that's like the slippery slope into fascism. It's not lost on me. There's only 2 panels at the Socialism conference about migration, although it has come up a lot at very many panels because it's so intersectional. And I think, when I think about Greg Abbott's scheme of busing migrants to cities, again, it's about the housing crisis. It's about not having those social safety nets in place locally. And so people are feeling that thing here in the south side of Chicago, what is the government doing for Black people, Black communities in the context of all these migrants coming? It's sort of, it's like, how are we going to pit them against each other? And Trump and other people have sort of played this up, right? And so I think there's no question that as we've sort of witnessed the conditions in which things are going to get better for immigrants, migrants, refugees, et cetera, at least in the US context, really, it also requires things getting better for everybody in the US. And that sort of shift from a scarcity mindset to more of a mindset of abundance. How do we make the whole pie bigger? How do we make conditions better for everybody? I want to end on this sort of question about what's happening now and what we can do now. And again, my obsession with Greg Abbott and what a nightmare he's been for all of this. in what we've seen, and folks might remember in 2010, the state of Arizona passed this bill called SB 1070, which was sort of nicknamed the Show Me Your Papers law, and as actually a really incredible site of organizing and struggle, like numerous boycotts of Arizona, both, political, social, cultural, like incredible work that went into sort of pressuring the Obama administration to intervene, which they eventually did, and it went to the Supreme Court and was ruled unconstitutional, and now they're trying to sort of challenge that, and Greg Abbott has been doing that in various ways, and now there's copycat bills all across the country, and the way that this is operating is actually merging not just the criminal legal system and, immigration enforcement system, which we've seen at the federal level, but at the state level. Now immigration crimes are being incorporated into state criminal law, and, even with SB4 in Texas, you see actually if you're quote unquote harboring or smuggling an undocumented migrant, if you're, traveling with somebody who happens to be undocumented and are caught, you could get up to a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence in prison. And the scale of which we're seeing this happen at the state level is so remarkable. And I think what abolition, I think in so many ways, what it teaches us, I think there's this sense, and especially during the BLM era and all this stuff, it's like, well, this is just about racism. This is about, that sort of like question of racial justice, but it is very much racial capitalism, and it's about the political economy of these systems. So when I was in Texas and I was witnessing how Operation Lone Star, which is one of these programs that Greg Abbott put in place, was functioning, you could kind of see it everywhere. You had law enforcement from all over the state, and even Louisiana, other places, coming to South Texas to help target people for prosecution. People would be prosecuted, and I witnessed one of the prosecutions where there was somebody who was caught for smuggling who was a U.S. citizen, and he had 2 undocumented migrants in his car, and he got a $400,000 bond in order to be released, and he was 21, a new father, and this was, that was sort of the conditions of what was happening. And then in certain counties, people would be prosecuted, they would give bond money, and then in the process eventually be deported, and all that forfeited bond money was going to Kinney County, this small South Texas county, and they were making all this money off those bonds. And in like Del Rio or Eagle Pass, around there, we saw actually all these organizers who had been going for months were noticing, because all this law enforcement was coming from across the state, that actually all these motel rooms were becoming more expensive because they wanted better conditions for them to stay in. And so you could see how it was changing the local economy. And at some point we were crossing the border into Piedras Negras, and the woman at the border, we had all these like End Operation Lone Star shirts, and the woman at the border was like, oh, I don't want you to end Operation Lone Star. Like, we're a really poor town. Eagle Pass is really poor. We need the money that's coming from this. So that to me is like, these are about bigger questions. It is about the political economy. There are reasons, there are incentives to keep these systems in place. And I think this particular thing that we're seeing, and Biden doing very little to intervene on Operation Lone Star, it's super concerning to see. I mean, in that moment, it took a lot to get to Obama to finally intervene, but he did 3 months later. I mean, again, international boycotts of the state of Arizona. It was a remarkable time. But now I do think a really important, like, we're seeing that merger even more, and so much of this and so much of my argument, because of what we saw in 2020 and because of what we're seeing around this merger, is that, part of our work for migrant justice in the U.S. is actually abolishing the prison industrial complex. It's such a central piece of this work, and so, yeah, I'll leave it there.
All right, so we have about 15 minutes for questions. If you have a question, come up to the mic at the front if you can.
Hello, thank you so much for both you speaking. I think my question can be for both of you, but mostly for me, the first speaker. So I'm a grad student at UC Santa Cruz, and I'm in a youth participatory action research project where we work with children of immigrants in Santa Cruz County. Most of them are children of immigrants of farm workers, and so we help them organize. But I can't help think about back home. So I was a teacher before I was a grad student in East Palo Alto, California, and the school that I worked for was about 90% immigrant youth, most of them being Central American. And I can't help but think about them and everything that they've been through. And I'm wondering, like, how can we organize immigrant youth? How can we bring them into these efforts? And if you know of any organizations that do organize immigrant youth. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe, do you want to
Yeah, why don't we take a few? Why don't we take a few? So go ahead.
Hi, my name is Rowdy. So my question is, how does the cultural biases of non-migrant/settlers, like the cultural biases that they carry, perpetuate the same repression that colonial states or imperial states enforce onto migrant struggles against borders, and struggles against prisons and displacement?
Okay. Should we just take these four? Yeah? Okay. All right, go ahead. Sorry.
So good to see you both. I was at that conference, the Detention Network conference in those years that you mentioned. So I'm coming from Florida. And, Florida. Florida. The most recent policies that were passed at the state level is really already terrifying communities. Like people, I'm glad that you drew on the connection between the labor, because right now I'm working out of a farm working community, and we just seen the mass exodus of people out of Florida with the recent, with those recent like policies that DeSantis brought on. But I do think that Florida gets under the radar much more than it should. But when Galtieri, when the sheriffs, the leader of the National Sheriff's Organization, was the one that passed the detainer policies at the state level, and then most recently with DeSantis passing this horrendous bill alongside Abbott. So, and then the other thing with Florida that I think in our collective conscience needs to rise up, it's its connection to Latin America and the Caribbean, and the struggles in Latin America and the Caribbean. For one, DR, I'm originally my family's from the Dominican Republic, and DR has replicated the same border policies to a more extreme apartheid state that, like, people don't recognize. And all this to say, but though, I do agree that there is solidarity across struggles, particularly the folks. So I want to see if, like, you've seen, like, where, both in the U.S. context and in the context of Latin American, people are joining and, like, messing shit up for the good.
Okay.
Do you want to take some of
Yeah, actually, why don't you, do you want to try to respond to some of those, and then we'll see if we have time for a couple more?
Well, with the first question, I mean, that's the thing, that this, like, way the non-profitization of the immigrant rights movement happened. It's this, like, concept of, like, there's these national organizations. There's so much work, and it's such a varied movement, and there's so much work happening at the local level across the country. And like in California, for instance, the California Immigrant Youth Justice Alliance, there's so many immigrant youth justice alliances and groups that are doing that. So I think there are ways to get involved, but I also think so there's already groups, if you're wanting to get involved, Detention Watch Network, we have member organizations all across the country. You can look on our website, and there's groups to connect with. But if that's not happening, like, finding ways to kind of bring folks together, and there's ways to plug in. There's a lot of different networks and groups like Baji and other people to plug in with to kind of help with some of that political education. And then I just, on the Florida piece, yes, absolutely. Like, I mean, that's the thing. You can kind of go down a rabbit hole of any of these places. Louisiana, I mean, so much to say about some of these places, but I do think, and I so appreciate it. I was thinking this as you were talking, bringing up the sanctuary movement, because I do think this is the time when we need to actually invest and start seeding some of that, like planting the seeds of, not seeding, planting the seeds of that sort of part of the struggle, and what could an immigrant justice, migrant justice struggle in the U.S. when we've lost so much of that really look like if we were to sort of build those relationships across, internationally. So I'm excited and eager to get in that, and I feel like that's kind of like the next sort of, like the really important thing that we do now in the context that we're in.
Thank you all. Thanks for those comments and questions. I'll just be brief maybe. In terms of the the transnational connections, I think part of it is there is so much transnational organizing that has been lost. Like so much of the farm worker organizing, for example, really used to be transnational organizing. And so, I mean, Silky would know better in terms of like specific organizations, but that is something to to continue to build and think through. In some cases, they do exist. Like, for example, a lot of the domestic worker organizing is quite transnational, thinking about, some of the international networks of domestic workers. And even in the case of farm workers, but they just used to be so vibrant because, so much of it is like people are constantly themselves on the move, right? Like having movements that are so circumscribed by borders also don't make sense to people's realities. And then in terms of the question around, how people reproduce those same kind of logics, I think there's so many different ways, but perhaps the most salient on my mind way is the idea that a lot of folks who have migrated through different ways and different paths continue to and or anew maintain this idea that I was here or I got here legally or I got here the right way, and then reproduce that kind of border logic against migrants who are quote unquote new migrants, right? That kind of old migrant, new migrant rhetoric, and how much of that is underwritten by ideas of desirability, of who is deserving, of legality, also of austerity, right? I made it, but now everything's crumbling, so no one else should make it. So those kind of ways in which, and we see this across communities and across movements, the ways in which that kind of nation state thinking, and then of course, and on and on and on kind of oppressive forms of thinking get tacked on to create ideas of who is a migrant and who is a deserving migrant and who is no longer deserving.
Hi, my name is Emily, and thank you both for being here, and thank you for also the last couple of comments made. I kind of wanted, so I have a comment and a question, and more thinking on how, the fight for migrant justice here in the United States, but also globally, has to be really international, and just thinking through how that, even with the recent example from the organizer from Florida, how we see that the apparatus of policing folks and policing migrants is something that is extending beyond the empire, and for us to really think about how to really address that issue holistically, we need to be thinking about how we also end up fighting against those states that are also kind of extensions of those imperial arms in a way, and creating struggles that are rooted in fighting for liberation of poor and working people, both internationally tied and tied for fighting for the liberation of poor working people here in the United States. So I think that's kind of what we need to be working towards, creating those types of struggles that are rooted in community here, breaking those barriers, Silky, the example that you were bringing up with Eagle Pass, and how there's someone from a poor working community there kind of seeing that need to have some type of seeing the need for ICE there, and then not really seeing that there is actually a world that we can build towards where you don't have to be relying on those systems. So our work has to be local, and then kind of expanding that to the global. It's so essential. So just wanted to elevate that. And the question that I wanted to really ask was for you both, and maybe to folks who are going to contribute afterwards, what examples do you look towards in your own organizing from the past that really kind of show to you that it is possible to break those barriers and start forming those moments of solidarity, both within like local communities and kind of bring that consciousness that this is a fight against this entire system that we have to be building towards. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Emily. That's a wonderful question to end on. So I'll turn it to both of you to do that.
What is that?
There's a few people waiting. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, if there's time for a few more.
Okay, yeah, I mean, if you want, come to the mic if you'd like to ask a question.
Thank you both so much for a great talk and for your work preceding this. I'm with Firebrand, and in Denver, we're called the Denver Communists. And your comment, Silky, that Governor Abbott is dictating immigration policy for the whole country really rings true. In Denver, Venezuelan migrants primarily are being bused against their will into our city, which I didn't mean to say like our city, like it's not open to Venezuelans at all. But they're coming in to very highly policed and underserved conditions. We've shown up to protests organized by Venezuelan migrants where they're locked in gymnasiums. They have showers that are available to them for like some short period of time. They have sheriffs guarding them as if they're criminals just for being migrants or immigrants. I guess I also wanted to thank you for emphasizing that borders are not meant to stop immigration, but to make immigrants vulnerable to a vulnerable section of our class, more vulnerable to exploitation and oppression and unable to organize. And connecting this to the fight for socialism, because creating segmenting the class in various ways by racializing people, by gendering people, by dividing with borders, ends up applying downward pressure to the wages and conditions of the whole class. So this is, I like to say, an injury to one is an injury to all, isn't just a funny slogan or cute slogan, it's a real reality. And as communists, we should make no distinction between the sections of our class that are created by our class enemies. And then I guess the other thing I wanted to say is that I appreciated how you emphasized that a border is not a line on a map or a line between two nations, but a network of repressive institutions that include courts and prisons and legislatures that extend internationally. And yeah, I guess that's it. I'm sorry I didn't formulate that into a question, but hopefully that you could riff off of that. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I just recently arrived to Mexico on a worker program, so it was very good to be here. What I wanted to ask, and like going a little more on these new versus old migrants, I feel that something that happened over the years with the border getting deadlier and deadlier is that one way to access the global north in general was to prove that you're a good migrant, and that's not only a good worker, but that's one way, but another way is to be a migrant who suffered. Like you have to prove that you were raped, you have to prove that you were, that life is just unbearable, right? Where you live, whether for climate, whether for crime, etc. No, and I'm from Mexico, so this is very like present for me. And I was just wondering, because it's also very hard in terms of the narratives that we build about ourselves and the type of movements that but it's also true, right? Like we're not here to say life is possible in some parts because it's really not. But then how do we build movements when both things are happening, and also I feel when states are very eager to find the suffering story, right? The always the raped woman, right? Like always the deceased person who cannot access any treatment, etc. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Last question.
Hi. I, as somebody that's also been around for a while, working on front lines, I always combine advocacy, individual advocacy with systemic change. So I like your systems analysis. I remember in Arizona, what struck me when that was going on was the deal that was cut between the government and a for-profit prison builder, and that was the reason that they wanted, that was the reason that they were going to create these harsh anti-immigration laws. I mean, some of the reasoning behind it, sort of like if we build it, they will come. So to produce criminals, they had to create these laws. And I had a question that I haven't heard it be addressed, and that is the way that it's important to manufacture a definition of security and safety and sell it. And in fact, if we redefine security and safety from, I worked in domestic violence, and the way that I see the use of those words is a sort of gaslighting. Like, you're not secure, you're not safe. I'll take care of you because you can't take care of yourself. And I wonder when we have manufactured that kind of insecurity, when in fact we are far more threatened by an Exxon corporate executive or Nestle's corporate executive that says water is not a right, than we are from any individual criminal, if you will. So they're kind of redefining this whole thing because that makes it easier to make these policies palatable to the mainstream. They say, oh, I'm not secure because of this. If we just redefine what that means, to be safe, to be secure, to have sanctuary within our own bodies and across the world.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Okay, that was a lot, and I know we're out of time. So a couple things I'm going to say. I appreciated that point about just sort of the narrative is so like, these individuals are desperate and they're needy and they're vulnerable and all these things and all this stuff, and it like takes away from the agency of all these people who are trying to migrate, who actually have a lot, who've like made really hard decisions for their lives. And like, it's a weird thing. It actually takes away, there's so much, I mean, part of the things, it's such a hard thing with the immigrant rights movement because there's also such an obsession with it being, you know, lawyers who are the saviors, but like the savior complex is so strong, and that actually takes away so much from our ability to build up movements and struggle in all these ways. And so I think countering that is so important. And then this last comment, I really do, you know, the lie they constantly tell us is that immigration is a public safety issue and that immigration is a security issue. It's not. It's about, as we've talked about, it's about labor, it's about family relationships, it's about seeking refuge. That is what immigration is about. And so I think we desperately need to counter that constantly and not just accept that frame. And so many people just accept it. And so that has to be a central piece. And that's a lot of what the book is about. And the one thing I'll just say, since we're closing, is that we actually have a reading and discussion guide that was written by Rachel Zaffer, who's incredible. And it's on the Haymarket website now. If folks plan to read the book or want to do it in a study group, it's available. So here it is. And yeah, thank you all for coming. And yeah.
All right, please join me in thanking Harsha and Silky for being with us today and sharing their deep insights based on decades of really, really important work. And thank you all for showing up and spending the morning with us.